So this is me. I'm here to introduce our next speaker, who will be Dr. Redpath. To find a definition of that person and formulate one sentence on him, I would say like this, that if you have any doubt that there exists a person who combines the excellence with efficiency, this is him. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for once again coming to this third annual Aquinas Leadership International World Congress. And before I start to talk about the topic today, I wanted to tie it into the initial conference that we had a couple of years ago, which was based on renewing the West by renewing common sense. And all of these conferences relate to that theme, which is part of a wider project of reuniting philosophy and science and wisdom in the West. And when I proposed that theme for that initial Congress, I had some people saying, well, common sense, it doesn't, it's just vague, and there's an admission about the fact that it exists, but just how you can identify it is problematic. But when I was using the term common sense, I was precisely thinking of it in terms of a particular reason, or cogitative reason, and estimative intelligence, as Bill McVeigh and I have been referring to it. And so I thought that after a couple of years, doing some more research on metaphysics and ethics, that the concept would gel and that something would coalesce, indicating what was behind the increasing disappearance of the skill of leadership from Western culture. And I think that that's the case over the past year. This has come to be in my mind. And I wanted to also let you know that later on today, we have a student of John Dealey, Mark Barker, who is going to be talking on cogitative reason. Particular reason, he's probably done more research on that topic than anybody. And I recall reading John's book on intentionality and semiotics a number of years ago, and thought that, wow, this is really terrific work. And then Mark Stallman had gotten a copy of it recently and pointed out and said, have you been in touch with the guy Mark Barker? And I said, no. He's footnoted throughout, right. And I even did a blurb review of the book at the time, saying it was kind of like the standard, the gold standard that you'd have to use for further research into St. Thomas's psychological teaching. And so I'm most pleased that we have Mark here with us, especially since John Dealey has been wanting to come to these sessions, and one obstacle or another has prevented him from so doing, but hopefully he'll be with us next year. So, okay, well, that being said, the paper is a little long, longer than I like normally, but I'm hoping that in it to relate the notion of prudence to particular reason, estimative intelligence in such a way that as to go beyond the leading thinkers who investigated the notion of prudence in the 20th century, chiefly Adler and Father Owens, Joseph Owens, did some significant research on it. Henry Veach, who was a good friend, and Richard Garrity, who wrote a great little work called The Object of Moral Philosophy in St. Thomas Aquinas, and has been teaching for a number of years for Holy Apostles College and Seminary. So hopefully that's the case. And if it's the case, then I think we have some really good projects we can work on in the future. Why nothing short of the moral psychology of estimative intelligence can hope to educate present and future leaders to promote global peace. Shortly more than 35 years ago, I wrote a little book about the moral teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas entitled The Moral Wisdom of St. Thomas. At the time, two chief reasons had caused me to compose that work. One, an increasing decline in Western culture and the West's understanding of the nature of moral activity. And two, the many poorly written and grossly misrepresented books related to St. Thomas's ethical teaching that had pained me to read during my youth. As a student of St. Thomas and a teacher, I thought I had a moral duty to compose at least an introductory report that would better represent the brilliance of his moral teaching. When I wrote that report, I did so with the intention of someday returning to the topic of St. Thomas's ethical doctrine to present a more exhaustive analysis of it, one that would include what he had to say about ethics, moral activity, against the background of a more completely developed examination of his profound and inimitable organizational psychology, his psychology of the human person, and moral psychology, and two, the incredible analysis to which he applies that moral psychology in his Summa Theologiae and commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle. A chief thing that annoyed me about the way the moral teaching of St. Thomas had been approached when I was a youth was that the study of his work was often undertaken for the wrong chief aim and tended to use the wrong method. For apologetic purposes, the wrong aim, in the form of arguments to be memorized, the wrong means, as a species of casuistry to refute this or that supposed school of philosophical thought, most of which are not philosophical at all, like moral relativism, social contract theory, utilitarianism, deontology, linguistic analysis, and so on. As far as I can tell, this chief aim and method is in presenting his moral teaching has not changed much since I was young. It still tends to be miserable. In contrast to this method and aim of teaching ethics, as Aristotle and St. Thomas understood, ethics, moral science, as they understood, people should study ethics, moral science, chiefly as a practical guide for living a happy life, the right aim, taught chiefly through the habitual exercise of right reason and right desire, pleasure, the right means. Morton Radler saw this clearly, for example. Except for the case of modeling moral virtue in personal behavior, the best apologetical tool, bar none, for the defense of universal moral principles that have guided people for centuries in the West and throughout the world, are those contained within the moral teaching of Aristotle and St. Thomas, as St. Thomas presents them in his writings as habits of the human soul, essentially ordered toward prudent living. So basically, the restoring estimative intelligence is really restoring a proper understanding of the nature of prudence, because what is absent most from the world today is prudent leadership. As I finally got around to writing this book, The Moral Psychology of St. Thomas Aquinas, An Introduction to Ragamuffin Ethics, I became increasingly aware that a chief reason St. Thomas's moral teaching serves as such an effective apologetical tool for defending universal moral principles is because his moral psychology is essentially rooted in a behavioristic psychology, immersed in the natural human desire to understand the nature of organizations and organizational leadership, and to educate human beings to become organizational leaders. That is, as far as I can see, ancient philosophy, the whole of ancient philosophy was the study of the problem of the one and the many, and chiefly in terms of organizations. Once you make that reinterpretation of ancient philosophy and then apply it to moral teaching, the moral teaching of Aristotle, you, as St. Thomas did, you come up with something radically different from the kind of deductive natural law type of emphasis that most students of St. Thomas have have been engaged in during the 20th century and even before that. While some members of the audience might disagree with this claim, consider it to be implausible, all that anyone needs to do to verify its plausibility is to consider what St. Thomas says at the start of his Summa Contra Gentiles, where he states that Aristotle and the many say the wise man knows order, that his office, business, duty is to know the order existing within things, in both speculative and practical ways to recognize and establish order in things. When St. Thomas asserts that the job of the wise man is to know the order that exists within things, he's simply saying that the chief job of a wise person is to know the nature of organizations, what constitutes their essential parts, and how multitudes have to be qualified and related to become parts that compose wholes, and to how to create organizations. As chiefly a Catholic theologian interested in wisdom as a means for achieving happiness in this life and the next, St. Thomas understood studying order necessarily to involve studying the rule of government that exists within the order of creation. Moreover, studying the rule of government evidently involves studying the nature of leadership, which in turn involves an ability to unite and divide multitudes. I was always fascinated by the organizational genius of St. Thomas, as well as of many Thomistic thinkers. No matter whether they understood imperfectly or imperfectly, still there was this unbelievable organizational genius that a lot of the Thomists had, as well as just Aristotelian scholars. And I finally thought, well, the reason for this is because he's chiefly an organizational psychologist. And if we mine his work from that perspective, we might get a great deal of wealth, intellectual wealth that we can use to solve problems in our own day. So according to St. Thomas, the nature of every science essentially involves two duties, responsibilities: studying contrary opposites within a subject genus, one of which is most perfect, the other of which is most deprived, like health and disease in the science of medicine, and two, supporting one contrary while opposing the other, for example, promoting health and fighting disease. Consequently, for instance, he maintains that the science of medicine's job is to effect health and to eliminate disease. In effecting its work in his commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, St. Thomas maintains that the job of science essentially involves knowing the order of one thing to another, that is, knowing the essential relation of one organizational part to another, of all parts to a highest part, and of all parts to numerically one chief aim, as communicated to all the subordinate parts through its chief or leading part. A chief reason for this twofold work of science is due to an essential twofold order or species of organization existing within composite wholes, of parts of a composite whole to each other, and of parts of a composite whole to a chief aim, end, or good of the whole, like the parts of a whole army to the whole army, because of an order of all of the parts to a commander, as communicated to the members of the army through a highest military officer. Consequently, the person most perfectly possessed of science, in some respect or absolutely considered, the responsibility of the wise man, the leader par excellence, the grand master of leadership, in any human activity, is to know the twofold order existing within any and every organization he or she studies, and especially to possess the leadership quality of knowing how to unite and divide organizations. Analysis and synthesis. In his first lecture on his commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, while generically considering the nature of science as a habit of human reason existing within the human soul, St. Thomas holds that in a fourfold way, order, organization, relates to human reason, and to the order or organization that reason observes, but does not cause, such as the order of parts to each other in physical things, that the ancient Greeks studied in the science of physics. To causes in its own act of judging and reasoning, when it arranges concepts and signs of concepts among themselves, like occurs in the arts of grammar and logic. 3, that reason causes in the operation of the human will, such as happens in moral science, the science of ethics and politics. And 4, causes in external things, when producing houses and the like, productive arts, such as mechanical and fine arts. According to St. Thomas, through the different orders and composite wholes that reason considers, habit, virtue, and especially the virtue of wisdom, perfect reason. In particular, through the consideration of these different orders and qualitatively different ways of being organized, reason develops within itself an architectonically arranged order of habits. The organizationally arranged composite wholes that reason studies comprise the formal objects or subjects of science. Science being a habit of the human soul activated by an externally existing organization or formal object for the chief aim of perfecting the human soul's 1, knowledge of the organization in question and of the person as an intellectual agent considered as a whole, and 2, natural desire to organize parts into a beautifully arranged whole that serves to perfect human life. That is, according to St. Thomas, differentiation of the sciences arises from an architectonic differentiation of habits, the means, related to perfecting the human intellect, the end, in its intellectual operations through different architectonically arranged, qualitatively more or less perfect orders, organizations, that the intellect is able to observe in composite wholes or cause within itself and things outside itself. You got this analogy, the order of organizations that are qualitatively different than the order of the faculties and habits, the habits of the soul, right, that are stimulated by these organizations as formal objects. For example, just as the subject of ancient physics is the part-whole relations existing within composite physical wholes ordered to generating motion, so the subject of moral philosophy, the science of ethics, consists in part-whole relations existing within human faculties that generate voluntary activity, freely executed acts. Hence, ethics doesn't study vegetative acts. It studies freely chosen acts that, properly speaking, make human beings, most specifically good or bad, perfectly or not perfectly human. Moreover, as a practical science, ethics does not study its subject with the same aim as a speculative science or with exactly the same method. In his commentary on Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, St. Thomas notes that generically, whenever science is at work, the intellectual virtue of right reason is at work. Wherever it is found, he says, right reason determines a mean between excess and defect, a state of perfection. While he doesn't precisely say so at this point, in speculative science, that mean would be truth, adequatio, a relation of equality of proportion, expressed in an intellectual judgment regarding the human intellect and what is. To explain more precisely the nature of right reason, in practical science, St. Thomas claims that in all moral virtues and all art, a person with right reason keeps his eye on the mark and object. St. Thomas says that this mark, object, virtue's formal object, is analogous to a rule for a craftsman. What is becoming, fitting, what we must not add to or fall short of, the proportionate equal, the mean of virtue, a proportionate equal relating contrary opposites within the same genus. In the case of the formal object of a practical science like ethics, which studies singular acts within contingent circumstances, he maintains that this mark, the moral universal, would be like the flexible leaden rule of a mason. What more than anything else holds an organization together, unifies it, its chief principle of order. Because right reason is crucial to understand, so as to comprehend the natures of virtue and science, St. Thomas inquires further about its nature by noting that right reason is something and the universal principle measure used in all human occupations involving practical science, like strategy, medicine, and so on, and also in speculative science. In all science, neither too much nor too little should be done, nor passed over. What determines measures is what holds the middle, accords with right reason. But St. Thomas adds, the man who considers this common measure rule alone, because of its generality, the many ways it can be applied, will not know how rationally to use it in the individual circumstance. For example, knowing that the right measure in science is right reason. If in an individual situation a person asked a medical doctor precisely what prescription should be given to this person at this time to restore health, based upon the rule of right reason, the physician could not answer that question with precision, any more than by making appeal to natural law, for example. The right prescription is the right plan of action. As an example, St. Thomas gives the following analogy. Just as the right plan, that is the order of choice, of prudence, that is right reason, is the right guide or measure, prescription in moral matters, so the right plan, order of choice, of art, right reason, is the right guide in art. Extending this analogy to speculative matters, following St. Thomas, we can rightly assert that the right plan of speculative science is the right guide of speculative, plan of speculative science is the right guide in speculative science, that is, the right order of judgment, reasoning. St. Thomas adds that, again, such examples taken from human habits are insufficient to know precisely how to operate in the individual situation. Put in contemporary military terms, that Scott will appreciate, hopefully. While they give the right strategy, they don't give the right tactics. Such examples are too generic. To make up for such deficiencies, we need a precise, specific definition of the limits of right reason, a precise, specific determination of the norm of right reason. To start to give such a specific, precise definition and determination, St. Thomas asserts that Aristotle begins a study of the intellectual virtues that regulate, order human reason. But because we cannot know the virtues without first knowing the soul, he prefaces this study with a discussion of the soul's nature. St. Thomas then tells us that Aristotle resumes study of the human soul by recalling its specific divisions into one, rational, absolutely considered, or simpliciter, whose formal objects are necessary beings, whose principles are unchangeable and invariable, that exist and act in one fixed way, and two, rational, relationally considered, secundum quid, by participating in reason perfected by moral virtue, whose formal objects, the organizations it studies, are contingent beings, whose principles are somewhat contingent variable. St. Thomas justifies this division by saying that different parts, faculties of the soul should correspond, that is, be proportionate to different formal objects, proportionate in intensive quantity, qualitative receptivity, and capacity, that essentially stimulate them to act. The qualitative receptivity and capacity of the faculty must be qualitatively proportionate in qualitative power of receptivity to the qualitative activity of the agent that activates it. Knowledge, he says, exists in parts of the soul according as they have some greatness of likeness, a proportion of likeness to the thing known. According to its peculiar nature, each faculty of the soul is qualitatively proportioned in receptive capacity, natural ability, virtual quantity, to know formal objects, organizational wholes that stimulate it. Aristotle calls scientific that part of the rational soul whose formal object, external stimulus, is necessary beings, beings that exist and act in only one way. He calls estimative the part of the rational soul whose formal object is contingent beings. He maintains that estimating, deliberating, refer to the same formal object, what is changeable, contingent. Because no one deliberates about what acts exist in only one way, he says that deliberation is an inquiry not yet concluded, like argumentation. St. Thomas, however, doubts this division that Aristotle makes is suitable, saying that Aristotle divides the intellect into two, the acting, that is the practical or productive, the power of operating on all things, and the potential, the speculative, the power of becoming all things. So by their very nature, they have the same formal object, it's true. Hence, they must belong to the same genus. The true about necessary matters and the true about contingent matters belong to the same genus. If by the same power we apprehend the extremes of the same genus, if, for example, the faculty of sight, which is less noble in power than the intellectual power, can see incorruptible beings, like the material bodies existing in the everlasting heavens, and contingent earthly bodies, so can the intellectual power know necessary and contingent truths. St. Thomas solves the apparent contradiction by saying that we can understand contingent beings in two ways, abstractly and concretely. Abstractly, we understand contingent natures according to fixed, necessary part-whole relations, in terms of their organizational parts being capable of generating their generic acts. Concretely considered, we understand contingent natures according to the way they necessarily operate, exist in the contingent situation. So there is some necessity even here in contingency. Abstractly, division of physics like astronomy study necessary and contingent beings as abstractly considered movers and agents. Concretely considered is the way practical sciences like prudence and art proceed. Prudence and art consider things as they concretely exist. Composite wholes as generating, causing specific acts in individual circumstances. They do this through the use of particular reason, the estimative sense, which initially individually induces, collates, mnemonically specifies into a quasi-nominalistic, I'm using my terminology, sensory experiential universal, some multitude into a temporal generic relation or order. For example, that whenever in the past some person has been sick with this disease, when given this medication, this person's health has been improved or totally restored. Thus understood, contingent beings and operational universals can be formal objects of the speculative and practical intellect. After dividing the parts of the soul, St. Thomas examines the intellectual virtues by which each part is perfected, by first proposing a generic definition of virtue as what renders good a thing's work. After giving this generic definition, he says he needs to consider the most excellent habit, the best virtue of each part, because this most excellent habit virtue perfects the proper operation of each part. When it guarantees that an action is performed in the best way with the highest quality and perfection, this habit would be best, of maximum intensity, of greatness in quality. To determine the proper operation of each part, St. Thomas considers the end, the good of each part. Regarding the intellectual part, he says two activities are proper to human beings: knowing the truth and self-mastered action. And three principles of the soul have mastery over, cause these two activities: the human intellect and the human will and sense appetite. Since neither the senses nor the sense appetite are psychological principles of truth, considered as such and in themselves, the senses and the sense appetite play no essential role in generating self-mastered, emotionally self-controlled moral action. Because they lack an intrinsic principle of voluntary activity, the power rationally, abstractly to deliberate. While brute animals have senses, these animals do not have within them moral principles that enable them proximately to generate moral intentions and interaction. St. Thomas maintains that the intellect and sense appetite of faculty can achieve a kind of unity and harmony, a peace, inasmuch as what the intellect abstractly and concretely declares good, the appetitive faculty pursues, and what it abstractly and concretely declares to be bad, the appetitive faculty avoids. This peace, harmony, is not found in other animals. St. Thomas asserts that the appetitive faculty and intellect can harmonize because they have proportionate, complementary, analogous, relatable powers. The intellect has two chief actions in judging: affirmation, by which it assents to, accepts, is receptive to what is true, and negation, by which it dissents from, rejects, resists what is false. Analogously, proportionately, these two acts correspond to two acts of the appetitive faculty: to be receptive to, tend, adhere to the good, and 2, to flee, withdraw from, resist, dissent from the bad. He maintains that in well-ordered moral choice and activity, these actions of the intellect and appetite harmonize, cooperate. St. Thomas calls choice the appetitive faculty deliberating, because choice essentially involves what has been rationally preconsidered, deliberated about. He asserts that choice is the concurrence of reason and appetite, an act of intellect commanding, prescribing action. For choice to be completely good, he contends that what reason commands must be true, and what the appetitive faculty pursues must be good, and what it avoids must be evil. St. Thomas claims further that in speculative knowing, absolutely considered, the abstractly considered true is good, and the false is bad. The good of the practical intellect, however, is not abstract conformity, abstract harmonization of the intellect with what is. It's concrete conformity of the truths of the intellect with right appetite. A prudentially rightly guided appetite, an act of the intellect conforming to right desire. Choice is essentially a composite act of the intellect commanding and the appetite consenting. Once again, this is something that Adler recognized. St. Thomas asserts that man, as a free agent, is a proximate principle of moral choice. The truth of the practical intellect is determined by conformity with right appetite, and right appetite is determined by the fact that the appetite agrees with right reason, prudence, conforming with fulfilling real human needs. Our human end is determined by nature, not by social contract or choice. Rectitude of the appetitive faculty to fulfilling real human needs, as determined by human nature, is the specific, precise prescription, measure of truth for practical reason. Once again, this is something Adler was right on about. Moral virtue is a habit of free choice. As a voluntary activity, free choice is directed toward real, not fictional means that actually fulfill natural needs. The truth of practical reason, the means that actually satisfy real human needs, the means really healthy to choose, is the precise, specific rule, measure of rectitude for the appetitive faculty. Hence, the appetitive faculty is called right, inasmuch as it pursues the means that reason considers true, suitable, fitting, proportionate, healthy in the individual situation. Like the speculative intellect, the practical intellect starts its reasoning from a universal consideration of a generic subject, but it concludes its reasoning in an individual doable deed, judged to be such in conjunction with particular reason, the estimative sense. The doable deed is the subject genus of practical science. Satisfaction of the doable deed terminates practical science, just as a true conclusion terminates speculative science in a demonstrative syllogism. According to St. Thomas, abstract, universal, and concrete particular reason have a relation to action, because it determines whether or not a deed is doable for this or that individual within the context of this or that situation. Particular reason, the estimative sense, specifies the action that universal reason generically considers. In both its speculative and practical divisions, the human intellect is a principle of action, abstractly judging what is, and to concretely choosing what can be a real means to a real end. Choice is the appetitive faculty under the direction of reason, commanding, organizing action after rational deliberation. Considered as such, it's an efficient cause, proximate principle of action. Choice is the appetitive faculty ordered to a means, commanded by reason as suitable for this or that end in this or that situation. In the act of choice, reason proposes an end and subsequently starts to deliberate about suitable means to achieve this end. After reason terminates deliberation, the appetite consents or does not consent to the end or means. The effect of choice in good or evil action cannot exist without comparing the deliberating intellect to some inclination existing within the appetitive faculty. Consequently, prior to choice being effected, the human intellect and the estimative sense must cooperate in comparing choice as a cause and the appetitive faculty being commanded to cooperate in effective effecting the cause. While the human intellect is a principle of action, St. Thomas maintains that considered in and of itself, the speculative intellect moves nothing else, because the speculative intellect prescribes and commands nothing about pursuit and flight. The intellect as a principle of practical action is an intellect intent on achieving, satisfying an end by harmonizing concrete operation, generating an individual action or thing as an end by being able to command facultative cooperation. Aristotle gives an example of the productive arts of a builder constructing a house for use as a shelter. This is a concrete individual product, not an abstract one, for a concrete individual end. In moral activity, in the individual situation, the choices that prudence arranges, harmonizes, are acts of the appetitive faculty as a means to an end of perfect operation. Following Aristotle, St. Thomas asserts that we commonly call a person prudent for giving good advice about proper and useful goods related to contingent matters. He claims that a quality common to prudent people is that they assume the end pursued is good, because to make deductions, correct inferences about things, means useful for an evil end is as contrary to prudence as it is for a dentist or medical doctor to assume that disease is the chief aim of dentistry or medicine. To start defining prudence through negative reasoning from effect to cause, demonstratio quia, St. Thomas observes that no one deliberates about things that are unchangeable or beyond our power. From the outset, in starting to define prudence negatively, St. Thomas takes for granted that this method of definition must involve use of cogitative reason, particular reason, or the estimative sense, a sense faculty in humans analogous to instinct in brute animals, one by which animals sense the natures of things as helpful or harmful, like the wolf causing a sheep to flee, or useful or useless, like that of straw for a bird seeking to build nests, as well as their own limits of health and strength. From this intellectual first principle involving use of estimative reason, St. Thomas concludes that, strictly speaking, because the principles of prudence are somewhat variable, flexible, not totally rigid, prudence cannot be speculative science, because syllogistic demonstration causes speculative science. And the subject whose principles prudence considers are not amenable to strict syllogistic demonstration. Prudence is about giving good advice regarding organizing plans of action, strategies, and tactics related to changeable matters worthy of deliberation, concrete actions to take in variable situations. Furthermore, St. Thomas maintains that prudence and art cannot be identical because they are different intellectual acts having generically different formal objects, qualitatively different kinds of doable deeds. Prudence studies the genus of action, chiefly aims at terminating choice, and a well-done deed related to living a good life considered as an organizational whole, while art studies the genus of making, and chiefly aims at terminating choice in a well-made product or performance activity, producing some organized whole like a house, a bridge, or a symphony related to this or that part of human life. St. Thomas maintains that knowledge of contingent beings cannot possess truth certainty in affirming truth and rejecting falsehood, and cannot perfect the intellect as speculative knowing can. However, it can perfect the intellect as commanding cooperation, controlling, prescribing the useful, doable deed, and directing human acts to satisfy ends. Prudence is a habit concerned with, one, action, two, things good and bad, healthy or unhealthy for human beings, and three, causing human actions that perfect human beings and our ability to satisfy real human needs. St. Thomas states that prudence derives its name from the Greek word phronesis, reasoning, while temperance derives its name from the Greek word sophrosune, preserving reasoning. Precisely by monitoring pleasures and pains of touch, temperance preserves right estimation of good acts to be done and bad acts to be avoided, while pleasure and pain have less of an impact upon right reason related to speculative judgments. He says they tend to have a major impact upon right reason related specifically, precisely, to estimating what needs to be done and avoided in practical matters in the individual situation. He maintains that this major impact occurs because in practical actions, what is best in the genus is the last act, the numerically one act for which all other acts are planned, harmonized, used as tools, done. the final act that all other acts exist cooperatively to generate, for which they do everything they do. For a person experiencing intense pleasure and pain, judgment of what is really best is often distorted. As a result, the judgment of the intemperate man does not see clearly the doable deed, a first principle of prudence, becomes unable to desire this as his real end. He takes his eye off the ball, as we might say today. He loses the appetite of strength to maintain focus under the pressure of emotional conflict involving pleasure and pain. Today, we would say that such a person inclines to choke under pressure. As a result, because his moral psychology is essentially unhealthy, to choose and do everything as a means for satisfying his real end, satisfy his real needs, no longer appears necessary to the intemperate man, or the intemperate political leader, for example. Like every moral vice, bad habit, the imprudent judgment of the intemperate man, including the intemperate leader, distorts the health of particular reason, with means to achieve ends, belonging to prudence, that is, with desire to fulfill real human needs. To some extent, the ability to act prudently exists. According to St. Thomas, the work of prudence is deliberating well. The prudent person without qualification is a good counselor, advisor, someone who can estimate among different alternatives what is best to do. Because prudence is a principle of action, prudence considers both universals, in which action does not occur, and singulars, principles of action. Since action chiefly has to do with singulars, concerning action, knowledge of singular principles of action is more crucial than knowledge of universal principles. Nonetheless, since prudence is right reason concerning the doable deed, the prudent person needs knowledge of universals and of singulars. While wisdom is the chief intellectual virtue, considered in an unqualified sense, St. Thomas asserts that prudence is the chief intellectual virtue related to human affairs. While wisdom does not consist of knowledge of human affairs, as a kind of architectonic command and control principle in relation to human relations, prudence exists in practical reason as a form of universal knowledge, rightly regulating individual choices through particular reason towards successful fulfillment in achieving their chief end pursued. According to St. Thomas, prudence is concerned with universals and particulars. As evidence of this nature of prudence, he refers to the ready ability of young people to excel in speculative sciences like geometry and arithmetic, but not to be so able to become prudent. The particulars, individual principles, singular extremes, he calls them, that prudence must know demand sense experience to induce. Comparing prudence to understanding, or the habit of understanding, St. Thomas says that both science and prudence are receptive of, in contact with, have some agreement with understanding as a habit of principle. Understanding concerns indemonstrable principles, extremes, for which no demonstrable proof exists, like whole is greater than any of its parts. Doable deeds are first principles, singular extremes of prudence, evidently known to the estimative sense, particular reason of the prudent man, by practical experience of living for which no proof exists. Such principles, singular extremes, doable deeds, and the nature of prudence as a moral virtue cannot be proved by reason, but are immediately known by themselves by the prudent person. St. Thomas maintains that prudence is chiefly concerned with, focuses its attention on the singular doable deed that must be taken as a principle of things to be done. He adds that no scientific knowledge exists for the singular doable deed because no scientific knowledge exists for singular terms, extremes of a relation, in this case of the estimative sense, particular reason of the prudent man to a doable deed. This singular extreme, the doable deed, is not apprehensible by any external sense faculty as a proper sensible. St. Thomas maintains it's apprehended by the inner sense faculty through which we perceive the sensibly imaginable like a triangle. Then he states, prudence perfects particular reason to judge singular relations, no doable deeds. He notes that even brute animals endowed with a natural estimative power are called prudent. The internal sense that has the ability to distinguish among proper sensibles like colors, flavors, and so on. The common sense is incapable of judging the singular relations involved in apprehending the natural strengths and weaknesses present in performing doable deeds. Transcending the qualitative power of the common sense as a property of the estimative sense. Particular reason, prudence, agrees with the habit of understanding in that both consider extreme terms of a relation, starting points, principles. Prudence differs from understanding in that understanding does not incline toward inquiry, while prudence inclines to a deliberation, which is a kind of inquiry. For example, is this act doable? Is it doable by me? Is it doable by me now? From the preceding claims he has made about the nature of practical principles of prudence and the way they are rationally applied, St. Thomas concludes that the perfection of particular reasoning, understanding of singulars, which essentially deals with practical principles, means to ends, follows from age and experience. Hence, this perfection of particular reason, the estimative sense, through the virtue of prudence, is the chief concern of moral or ethical education for all human beings for all time, and especially for people whose aim in life is to become some sort of leader. Hence, in practical matters, especially those of moral concern, St. Thomas contends that we must pay special attention to the opinions and decisions of experienced, especially prudent elderly people. While such opinions and decisions do not lead to speculative demonstrations in practical matters, St. Thomas maintains they lead to something more crucial, right moral induction, apprehending principles of practical understanding, apprehending doable deeds. Just as in universal principles of speculative understanding, absolute judgment about singular principles of practical understanding, singular extremes, belongs to understanding. In the case of practical judgment to sense understanding, particular reason, the estimative sense. Prudence chiefly belongs to particular reason, which concludes from one singular experience to another. Considered in this sense, prudence exists as part of the soul different from that of intellectual reason, but participates in intellectual reason, which intellectual reason and with it the human will ultimately commands and controls. In conclusion, St. Thomas maintains that wisdom, the chief virtue in speculative matters, and prudence, the chief virtue in practical matters, exist in different parts of the soul. Immediately following this conclusion, St. Thomas notes that some people might raise the possible objections about the utility of prudence for human life. One such objection is that while prudence considers actions by which we might become happy, it appears unnecessary, because by an inner habit of inclination, not knowledge, the concern of prudence, a person performs noble and honorable, that is, useful deeds toward himself and just deed towards others. While in some cases, from a knowledge of his art, an artist acts well as an artist, such intellectual influence is incidental to the art. The habit of the art, repetition of action, not knowledge, generates the good of the art. Hence, virtuous habits, routines of action, not prudence, induce a man to do the good. St. Thomas responds to such claims by saying that because prudence would not be useful when men are already good, such a reply appears to be unreasonable. To become virtuous, we need prudence. And to start to become prudent, we need instruction by prudent people. Even if prudence does not give to a human being the qualities of soul, talents that generate well-made products, or that enable a person to become a better performer in one act of human life or another, like being a better singer or a dancer, it produces a far greater quality of good. It contributes to human happiness by causing every artist to be psychologically healthy as a whole human being. Regarding the objections about prudence contributing nothing to happiness, he says that both prudence and moral virtue perfect the work of virtue. In a work of virtue, we need two things: right desire for the end that moral virtues like temperance, courage, and justice provide, and right reason about the means to secure these ends that the preceding virtues pursue and which prudence provides, which includes taking delight in the right means, which the other moral virtues cannot possibly provide. In a morally virtuous operation, a concurrence of prudence and these other moral virtues exist. Prudence cannot exist without the moral virtues of temperance, courage, and justice. And the moral virtues of temperance, courage, and justice cannot exist as complete or perfect virtues without prudence. Without prudence, the moral virtues of temperance, courage, and justice are not complete as moral virtue. And without temperance, courage, and justice, neither is prudence complete as a moral virtue. For total moral virtue to exist, two operative principles must exist: right desire or right pleasure, and right reason. Not everyone who does temperate, courageous, or just acts, even habitually, is morally virtuous. For example, when we do just acts under the force of law, out of ignorance, or chiefly for personal gain. To be morally virtuous, a person must know and love, take delight in, get pleasure from doing the temperate, courageous, or just deed. For this to occur, the means designed by nature, means naturally proportionate to right reason and right desire. Prudential choice, real, not fictional means that actually lead us and enable us to secure the end, must be known, loved, delighted in, and chosen, considered as such. St. Thomas maintains that an operative power resembling prudence exists in particular reason, the estimative sense, shrewdness, craftiness, cleverness, and the ability to execute well acts ordered to an end, whether morally good or morally evil. I think St. Thomas would look at this today and identify this as physical science, contemporary physical science. He claims, moreover, that prudence is a species of shrewdness, craftiness, cleverness, ordered to the morally good. Because shrewdness, craftiness, or cleverness is sometimes identified with prudence, and prudence is sometimes conflated with wisdom. Some people mistakenly conclude that prudence or wisdom are not needed for happiness. Nonetheless, St. Thomas claims that the habit of prudence is never united to this estimative power related to choosing means to an end without right desire, moral virtue. Just as universal first principles of reasoning exist for speculative science, so in practical science, the supreme good, happiness, living a perfectly good human life, exists as a universal principle, a singular extreme, a singular ultimate of practical reasoning. To the morally virtuous person, through practical experience of living, the supreme good as the final end and the temperate good as the proximate end, an enabling means we need to pursue in the individual circumstance, are evidently known as causal principles of each and every right choice, universal principles, just as evident first principles of speculative reason are immediately apprehended by a person who knows the meaning of part and whole. Because prudence and moral virtue exist within this person's estimative sense power, and because the virtue of prudence simultaneously exists, but in different ways, as a command and control principle within the universal intellect and the particular or sense reason of a prudent man within the individual circumstance, this morally virtuous person apprehends with precision universal and singular first principles of moral choice, the universal and singular extremes. What is really good, considered as an end and as a real means in the individual circumstance, to the abstract intellectual reason appears really good to the estimative sense of the prudent man. St. Thomas maintains that moral vice perverts the judgment of reason and causes deception in the conception of practical principles, doable deeds, on the level of universal and particular reason. Since we cannot reason well when we are mistaken about principles, the moral psychology of imprudent, incontinent, intemperate, vicious people prevents them from being able habitually to reason well in practical matters. Their unhealthy moral psychology prevents them from being able habitually and precisely to conceive the human good, the good doable deed, or the means to it within the individual circumstance. Since just these sort of people tend to dominate in positions of organizational leadership globally in pretty much every profession today in the West, no wonder should exist why nothing less than the organizational, behavioristic, and moral psychology of St. Thomas that I've just described can hope to remedy the situation and provide the educational principles we now need to generate present and future leaders who can help affect global peace. Thank you. Sorry for the length, but
thank you very much, Dr. Redworth. And now we have pretty much time to have a discussion. So I presume that these papers, these documents, it is all filled up with your questions. So now, please, Professor.
In the New Ethics, Aristotle makes a distinction between intellectual virtues and moral virtues. And when he gives examples of the intellectual virtues, he he's defined them, described them as those that can be learned from a teacher. And he gives two examples, as I recall, mathematics and prudence. Prudence is an intellectual virtue.
So, yes, right.
All right, now, obviously, it's all, as you described it, it's a moral virtue also. So, is it in both camps? And is there, in other words, the moral virtues are those that we have to practice until they become habitual?
Yeah, he
So
also
there's
says
hope for all of us to become prudent?
yeah,
It's a
that this
moral
can be
virtue.
taught.
What did Aristotle miss, though? Why does he make that categorization? I wonder what he missed.
No, well, first of all, this regarding Aristotle is a question of whether he actually has a doctrine of will. You know, it's like similar to St. Thomas. This is why I focus attention on St. Thomas and the way he's been interpreting Aristotle. But prudence is an extremely fascinating quality, psychological quality of sound, because it exists in the intellect and in the will, and in particular reason. And in order to be able to exercise it as a moral virtue, you have to be able to recognize your particular abilities in the individual situation. St. Thomas has got this fascinating passage where he talks about, and this drives students of St. Thomas, Thomistic scholars, batty, and trying to figure out when he says that at times the individual circumstance enters into the specification of the moral act. I said, it's clear. He says, now how do you, what's he talking? If you think, well, you know, that universal principles are logical principles, abstract and universal, how, you know, he's talking about the individual extreme, you know, as a final cause, as universal. Because it's a command and control principle that operates by preventing a person who's operating from deviating from a straight course to the end. So no matter what tries to get you off course. I was talking to a friend of mine who was a pilot and also a Scot about this. I said, he's a pilot. I said, what would you call it? You know, this kind of quality that keeps you on track, so you can't. This way you kick in your gyros. You got to go on automatic pilot. Now, all of your actions, you know, are being regulated and drawn back into this same path. But the universal is different. Father Owens saw this. He wrote an article that John Kagan had published in his collected volumes about as the habit as a moral universal in Aristotle. It's only a moral universal to the extent that it's related to an end. And Gilson in his in one of his early works on St. Thomas and Thomist realism and the critique of knowledge, he makes this fascinating observation about how particular reason is required for philosophical investigation to occur because of sense wonder, and that this is something that escapes the notice of the external senses. So when St. Thomas is talking about prudence, he's basically talking about reason that can be considered abstractly, and he makes reference to this principle which he calls synesis, right? Which precedes your practical prudential types of judgment, but in a speculative way, it gives you awareness, you know, of the smart moves to make in the individual situation. So, in a sense, there's a speculative kind of prudence that precedes your ability to deliberate in the individual situation. But for you to deliberate in the individual situation and make the right choice, you have to have an awareness of your own personal abilities, right? How strong you are or how weak you are. And so up until the very last moment, in a very complicated moral situation, you can't determine whether you're voluntarily acting or not, right? until you've made that final decision to choose this act. In some situations, not in every situation, but in some situation. So it's the specification of the moral act always involves the use of particular reason. And if you don't have this, if you don't have this faculty, if you don't recognize its existence, then there's no way for you to explain the moral principles that St. Thomas is talking about in relationship to the different faculties of the human person. And so it's very easy then to conclude that the whole of St. Thomas's moral teaching that we should be emphasizing, debating about, are about 6 pages in the Summa related to natural law. Drawing deduction, which is actually an induction of a first principle, right? Like synthesis, right? That's not the reasoning that's involved, in moral decision making. And so what the Catholic Church has been doing for centuries, and especially during the 20th century, in beating up students' intellects in classrooms and memorizing these principles and using them as casuistic kinds of moral defenses, is they've been preventing people from actually examining this treasure that is contained within his moral teaching, which is, as you go through his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, you increasingly see he constantly examines the psychology that's behind the imprudent person, the intemperate person, the incontinent person, the courageous person, and so forth. So I think it becomes pretty evident that if you abandon the faculty psychology that the ancient Greeks had, where they look at ethics as perfecting the human soul, and qualitatively, in a sense, to beautify the soul in the performance of these actions, then you can't do ethics anymore. As the ancient Greeks did it, you have to make believe it's something else. And you turn it into these debates that go on in most college and university classrooms that tend to be absolutely worthless, more destructive than good.
People used to read Plutarch's Lives to illustrate these very points you've been making.
And then they started reading the lives of the saints.
Sure, and it's precisely because they did that they got the moral virtues out of, as Bill McVeigh likes to say, out of this competitive, these competitive kinds of principles that enable cooperation within organizational wholes, and account for the harmonization of these different talents.
One of the things, I'm Mark Stallman. I'm new to the group. You'll hear more from me tomorrow. I literally wrote Peter an email a couple of months ago, in particular asking about John Dealey. And as I've been you've been doing this for years, you know that. One of the things that really struck me powerfully about John Dealey was his sharp distinction between the Greeks and the Latins. In particular, he makes a very big deal of Augustine not knowing Greek. And ultimately this leads, of course, to the Great Schism. So here we are talking about the Greek and Latin. And I'm just wondering, as you've gone through this, if that constitutional difference between the Greeks and Latins emerges as you've been doing this research.
No, I don't think it's the Greeks and the Latins. It's the Arabs, because St. Thomas gets this from Avicenna, the focus on particular reasons. That I don't think there might be some medieval scholastics that weren't influenced by Avicenna, but not one who can say, right? But as far as I know, it was the Arab tradition and Avicenna's focus of attention.
What is the connection between this estimative intelligence with all the 20th century phenomenology, this idea that we are all wired in a different way. So we have different ways to know the truth. Some is more sensitive, some is more intuition or affection or rational. How do you enable
It
things?
depends upon the phenomenology you're talking about. If you're talking about Husserl,
I know the followers.
that's the Cartesian kind of tradition. You're talking about Sokolovsky, and Frank Slade. Then this ability on the part of particular reason to formulate a judgment based upon memory that is. In fact, I think Dealey refers to this in one of his works, that even on the animal level, there's a knowledge of the universal. And he's referring to in relationship to cogitative reason. And if what you think of as a universal is a concept, and you don't relate it to a judgment, then you can never understand why Aristotle is talking about how you have to have this experiential universal based upon memory. That has to precede it, and you have to be able to describe it. So I would say that in that sense, there's a kind of phenomenological act of description in relationship to your own understanding and the way you understand yourself in the situation that enables you to measure your powers and abilities against what you're contemplating to do in the practical situation. And until you recognize this is possible for me to do because of the powers and abilities that I have, you don't have the first principle by means of which you can engage in practical activity. That's why if you abandon the faculty of psychology, you're totally lost. Because trying to explain practical action is not possible.
But Peter, the other quick answer is that modern psychology, empirical psychology, has no idea of estimating intelligence or estimating sense. Therefore, most modern empirical psychology is built on straws, open quicksand. Okay? Without the concept of prudence, as Aquinas understands it, and estimated intelligence, I argue you can't build a psychology of a person. You can build psychology of the brain, you can build a psychology of dynamics, but you can't have a psychology of the person unless you understand all the faculties like the soul, and particularly the prudence has to be the sense. All psychology and phenomenology is built on quicksand. It's such a win.
Now, in our the age in which we are now living, and Mark is interested in this, the power of technology, and organizational decision making, that distinction that St. Thomas makes between the habits of an art or performance activity and the situation in which it exists, the surrounding circumstances that have an influence on your being able to remain psychologically healthy, right? As you're engaging in your organizational activity, this becomes crucial for people within organizations to understand because of the quick decision-making and the enormous pressure that emotionally, psychologically, that major executives are put under by new technologies. So if you go into an organization and you want to do it as an organizational psychologist or an executive coach or something like this, and you go into major executives and you're going to tell them, I'm going to tell you how to do your job, and so forth, and because I've got the secret method, whatever, like Jonathan Haidt, of understanding these principles that I got from David Hume, then you're giving them nothing. You can't contribute anything to the. I can't tell them. I can't tell Scott how to fly a plane. Something, but I can tell him, hey, Scott, I've got some advice with respect to how you're not going to psychologically crash. When you're doing that, if you develop these other habits that support as a moral culture what you're doing, and I think that this is present in in St. Thomas. I've just given you a brief survey of some of the things that I'm talking about. It says in this moral psychology.
But the most important thing you said today, this should be underlined and put in brackets. Prudent people should listen to elderly people. That's very important.
You'll look better, right?
That's the point.
Yes.
I have a question about the estimative sense, because if I'm understanding you correctly, the estimative sense is in both brutes and men, but brutes don't need prudence. The estimative sense is sufficient to indicate what is to be sought and avoided. So why then in men is it not sufficient? Is it because of the will?
Well, it's because brute animals don't distinguish between appearance and reality. They identify everything as real. And there's this distinction in St. Thomas between the concupiscible appetite and the irascible appetite. Right? And the concupiscible appetite reacts to pleasure and pain. Pursues pleasure, avoids pain. And it doesn't distinguish between real and unreal. It considers all pain as evil, all pleasure as good. Right? And so I maintain, and I haven't seen St. Thomas directly say this, but I think it's implied in his work, that the concupiscible appetite is consequent upon the common sense faculty and the images that are present in that faculty, whereas the irascible appetite is present, and this must be the case, with respect to the irascible appetite, because it reacts to danger and difficulty, right? And the concupiscible appetite does not do that. So it's only on the level of the particular reason that we start to sense the natures of things generically. This is the sheep. Doesn't reason. All wolves are dangerous. The sheep, I'm a sheep. I'm running away. Sheep. Wolf. You run away. And whereas that faculty enables us to recognize the useful and the useless in the individual situation and situate ourselves within the environment. John Daly talks about this, probably following Mark over there. So I'll be interested in hearing what he has to say about this. But I think that's a crucial distinction to make, because Aristotle and St. Thomas see us using the faculty of temperance that regulates the concupiscible appetite to educate the irascible appetite, so that it can then direct the concupiscible appetite to make right choices by being in touch with limits of pleasure which satisfy natural needs. Aristotle points out that all of the natural faculties in a human being have a limit of pleasure, which is a healthy pleasure, a right limit of pleasure. And we use that as the measure for determining the habits of development for educating children and adults. And when we start to exceed those limits of pleasure and become incontinent or intemperate, then what we do on the level of particular reason, we cut ourselves off from reality, and eventually people who become increasingly incontinent and intemperate can no longer listen to reason, because they identify reality with pleasure, and they consider any kind of an argument against what they're doing to be an attack of irrationality and violence, hate speech. So necessarily they'll have to look at this, and so arguments are not going to persuade. St. Thomas says, it's useless to argue, to try to argue with these people, because they can't be shamed. And the shame comes from that irascible appetite. We recognize there are qualitatively higher goods that perfect the soul and have to do with beautification of the soul and the perfection of its operation. And if you don't accept the reality of the soul, which largely Western culture has abandoned, including most of the clergy, I'm thinking of German particles in particular. How are you possibly going to provide moral education? How are you going to hear confessions? For example, you don't have to believe in the natures of things, and the way St. Thomas and Aristotle were describing it. It becomes impossible. I don't know any other way out of it, because choice is only possible. You don't have any powers of choice. How do you discuss ethics or inculcate it into the culture, into the educational system, so that you can develop leaders, real leaders?
It seems to me that the teaching of history provides the opportunity for the imagination to engage with what-if scenarios. Now, we all know that knowledge of history in our culture is absolutely terrible.
Yes, sure.
Sure. Do you think that's the way to turn this around? I mean, I'm in complete agreement
Oh, yeah.
with your understanding of St. Thomas.
Oh, sure.
But how do we solve this problem given this philosophical?
Yeah, you do it by heroic figures, as as one instance of stories by means of which you educate children. But the Enlightenment educational system that exists in the West can't possibly present this kind of a teaching, because it inclines to think that ethics is caused by religion.
So Mortimer Adler would promote the great ideas. It was once fashionable to teach history speaking of great men of history. Of course, that's not fashionable anymore.
Right.
Who wants to promote?
Oh, well, in fact, as you know, our brother did not promote history.
Well, he didn't focus attention on history, right?
Yeah, no, I was drawing a
This
contrast.
automaton destroys history.
Yes, I was drawing a contrast between the great ideas and the great man approach of teaching history. Given that both these approaches are unfashionable, how do you think we should deal with the situation now? Should we go back to great ideas, go back to humans in history, apart from historical forces, which are the fashionable thing for historians nowadays to talk about, rather than people?
Well, what I think we have to do, and one of the things that I'm interested in developing coming out of this this conference, as I started to see this past year working on that volume 2 and then of the not so elementary Christian metaphysics of the moral psychology, that you really need us to focus attention on the behavioristic psychology. On a center for Thomistic organizational, behavioristic, and moral psychology, you're not going to be able to use the public schools chiefly, as this means for doing this, but you can work with different Jewish and Christian groups and religious groups and one sort or another to help inculcate children with these principles, and to do so on a level like I used to work with Matt Litton's philosophy of children program, and do that sort of training to bring the moral education in on that level. But that, I think, the first, you have to take baby steps, and the first step that you have to do is you have to see where the corruption is most pervasive, and capture that field, right? And set up your beachhead, and then move forward from there. And I think that's where if you get, my model is the Jesuits pursuing the 1%ers. The Jesuits abandoned the whole educational institution. They had it, and everything else within the Catholic tradition in the West depended upon those Jesuit colleges and universities and generating leaders, and they gave that up. And threw it overboard, and as a result, they've lost their identity.
So your prudent advice is that first we take Manhattan.
Yes, absolutely, that's right. That's right. First take Lower Manhattan, you get the evangelicals.
I think it's much easier to be missionaries to the elites.
Yes, right, but that's what you have to take Lower Manhattan.
Actually, that's not the right place. And as you'll hear more tomorrow, my center focuses on the elites, and particularly consultants at the Pentagon.
Who wants to go to Jersey City?
No, we consult at the Pentagon, the Vatican, and the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not kidding. Those are the elites. These you don't.
Are there factors other than morally culpable ones, vices that contribute to the degradation of cognitive reason?
Well, sure, they can be.
Like environmental.
Sure, absolutely.
The architecture that we've just heard today leaves a very significant component out. Chris mentioned a piece of it, but between the exterior senses and cognitive reason, there's a vast unexplored territory. That's the environmental territory. That will be the topic of my conversation tomorrow. But the primary components of that territory, which have not been discussed so far, are imagination and memory. The interior senses.
That are corrupted by a certain experience.
They're totally corrupted by the technologies we use. Or so I would think.
But the other answer I would give is addiction destroys the estimated senses.
Right.
Any form of addiction.
Well, there seems to be a correlation between new technologies and ignorance of history amongst the populace. Correlation.
Yes, there is.
Ladies and
There's a very
gentlemen,
strong
I'm so sorry. I cannot find a way not to be rude, but we have reached the time. So please, discussion can be held, but in the lounge. Now it's time for your coffee. You deserve it. Thank you very much, Professor Weber.